when I was leader of the Commons. And we had just got to the point of our recommendations. And as we know, Theresa May resigned and the rest is history. But Boris Johnson, as the new Prime Minister, has been very keen and willing to have a complete new look at the early years, the period from conception to the age of 2. And so back in February, when I went back to the backbenches and said to him, I really want to carry on with the work that we started in the IMG, he said, yes, you absolutely must. So that's the background to this. So this Early Years Healthy Development Review has been going since July, but it leads on from the work that was done in the interministerial group. So it didn't go kind of back to square one, throw everything away and start again. So what we're doing between July and January is I have a team of 6 really good, really strong civil servants who are coming from more of an implementation background than from an early years background. So they are all, as people so often are when they sort of look for the first time at how infancy is so integral to your lifelong emotional and physical health. So they're all a bit kind of eyes wide open about what they're learning. But at the same time, the skills they're bringing is in implementation. So my feeling is that in this review, when we get to January, we will be setting out what excellent looks like for every baby in that critical first 1,001 days, the period from conception to the age of 2. And within that, there are some emerging themes. I mean, obviously, I'm carrying out this review for the government, so, not quite ministerial rules, but you wouldn't expect me to be telling you exactly everything that we're thinking about. But there really are some interesting emerging themes. Some of them as a result of the lockdown, but most of them actually anyway, reaffirming what was already said during the interministerial group. So one of the emerging themes, not surprisingly, is that families feel they have to tell their story too many times to too many people, whether that's to the midwife and then the health visitor and then the GP and then the mental health worker and then the volunteer and then the social worker and then, and families find that deeply frustrating. And of course, it's very, very time wasting. So only having to tell their story once. And if you swivel that around and look at it from the other end of the telescope, what professionals and volunteers, the early years sector is full of the most fantastic volunteers and charities. So if you look at it from all of their perspective, they get sick and tired of the lack of data sharing. So they also want to know, what was the background to this family? I mean, extraordinarily, we know that social workers use one system. They don't share it with anybody else. The midwives have their own system. They don't share it with anybody else. And it's not malicious on their part. It's just that the systems don't talk to each other. So one of the, I think, emerging themes is the sharing of data. So parent only tells their story once. They then own their own maternity notes, early years notes, health visiting notes, potentially whether they struggle to breastfeed and how they managed. And so that when they go on to have second or third children, they can actually look back themselves and think, oh, right, okay. So the NHS is already looking at a digital red book, but I think we can do a lot more than that. I think we could put the parent into owning their own medical notes. Now, some say, oh, yes, align it all to the GP system. I'm not. I think that's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I think the early years period, that unique period, is absolutely its own thing. So if you can put the parent in the driving seat and allow the parent to decide, alongside possibly their health visitor, access to their story, but that then they have that as a reference point, but so do professionals. Second theme that's emerging is that although lockdown has been incredibly difficult, we definitely have a much more digitally savvy, growing generation of parents. And they don't want, I mean, as all of you who have had kids will recall, when you've got a new baby, the idea of getting up, getting dressed, having breakfast, getting the baby dressed, changing the baby again, then the baby throws up all over you, then you get the baby in the buggy, then you walk down to the surgery, stroke library, stroke children's centre or whatever. Those things are incredibly difficult. And so for new families, quite often, if they've got a question or a concern, they would much rather ask someone by text or by chat or by an app. And that, of course, now the pandemic, the lockdown, has forced us to sort of almost leap 5 years ahead to a position where families have found it genuinely helpful to be able to contact their health visitor or their social worker via Zoom. Now, that in no way replaces face-to-face, and that's the third emerging finding, is that families desperately, definitely want face-to-face. And it's not just face-to-face with a health visitor, it's also face-to-face with other parents, so that they can share sort of stories of weaning and sleeping and nappy changing and all the rest of it. But definitely also with people who can give them advice. So place is important, digital is important, data sharing is important. And then I think the fourth theme that again really came up in the IMG and has come up again this time around is dads. Where are the dads? You know, the focus is far, far too much on mum and infant. Now, when I say dads, I mean other partner. So I'm not being pejorative here. Dad or other partner in that relationship, if there is one. And of course, that in some relationships, it might be another woman, it might be a mum, it might be a very good friend, you know, the person who is supporting you and helping you through this thing often themselves needs some help and support, and very often gets left out of the equation, not asked and not supported. So that's just a few of the emerging themes. I think in terms of what we'll be recommending, I feel my own view is we'll be recommending what perfect would look like. So if you could have limitless amounts of money and resources and people and services and trained qualified people to deliver all those services, what would you have? And of course that would start with, you know, it would start with midwifery, and it would be antenatal mental health checks as well as physical health checks. It would go on to health visiting, home visits, antenatally and postnatally. You'd have parenting classes, you'd have parent-infant mental health support, you'd have parental conflict reduction, substance misuse reduction, you'd have debt advice, you'd have housing advice, you'd have childcare advice, you know, you'd have everything. And you'd have that in urban areas in a place, and in rural areas you'd have some places and you'd have some outreach, you'd have some hubs, you'd have digital everywhere, you'd have NHS 111 with a, you know, if you're calling about yourself or your baby, press 1, and then you go to a team of experts. So I think you would try and capture everything that would be needed, including adoption services and babies with disabilities, or parents with disabilities and babies without disabilities, because that presents its own particular unique set of challenges. And then what I would do is I would seek local authorities to then define what do they need in their area. Here's the kind of the, if you like, here's the total of what perfect would look like. Now, what does your area need? Knowing what you do about your geography, your demographic, your, you know, do your parents all speak English as a first language? Are they incredibly young and lone? Are there rough sleepers amongst them? Are there people with substance misuse problems, domestic violence? You know, you name it. Have you got a high population of academics for whom having a baby is a traumatizing experience because they felt so in control and now suddenly they're not? So they've got no sort of obvious deprivation except for a psychotic episode due to hormonal imbalances. So you'd look at what perfect looks like, and then you would let local authorities define what that looks like on the ground. And then I think that would require, in my view, co-funding of those services. So the interesting thing in our review is that we've had lots of examples of really good practice. And I've been working with Anne Longfield for 10 years, really, ever since I became an MP, on the importance of the early years. And she chaired a charity that ran lots of children's centres before she became Children's Commissioner. And she is very knowledgeable about different local authorities. So she's been able to present to us what really good looks like. But of course, the reality is there's 159 of them, and about 10 of them are what really good looks like. And lots of others, you know, if you talk to the local authority, they'll talk to you about 3 and 4 year olds. And if you ask them about the perinatal period, they'll say, oh no, you need to talk to health if you want to know about that. So that's completely perfection in terms of lack of join up. So how not to be. So that's really where we are. I mean, I'm just really telling you some of the amazing input we've had. We did a questionnaire, which we got 3,600 responses to. we're now analysing. That's a lot of responses for a government questionnaire on any topic. It was to parents, helpers, professionals, grandparents, anyone could answer it. Lots of people chose to. So we're analysing those responses to try and give some sort of statistically significant input. We know that our demographic, our seldom heard voices, needs further work. So very young parents and BAME parents, and also dads, we're lacking if you compare the responses to the population. So we need to do more work on that. We've had fantastic virtual day-long visits with Camden Children's Centres, so for a very urban view of very good services, and also with Devon for a very rural view of very good services. And so we've learned a lot about how they are amplifying their offer. We've got 3 advisory groups, one of cross-party parliamentarians, cross-house and cross-party. We have another advisory group of professionals, which is, chief nurse, chief health visitor, speech and language therapist, etc. And then we also have an advisory group of academics, so people who've worked in the area of what works, but also people who've worked in the area of infant brain development, attunement, evaluation. So I think we've covered a lot of areas, and we are now just literally, in fact, today, having our first conversations about our recommendations. So I think that's all I can really tell you about this so far, except to say that I've always said, since I went into politics, I won't leave politics until this happens. So if anyone wants to get rid of me, they're just going to have to do this, sort this out for the early years, and then I can go quietly and get out of everyone's hair.
I'm going to draw a line here and thank Andrea very much for her fascinating presentation. So thank you very much, and I hope you feel that it's been a two-way stretch as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for your input.